Hello, welcome to Encounters. My guest today is Dr. Richard Sclove. He is a local living in Amherst, and he is the founder and senior fellow of the Locus Institute. May I, to start with, ask you what the Locus Institute is?
Yes, Locus is a small nonprofit that works nationally and internationally on making science and technology more responsive to democratically decided priorities.
Wow, that's a mouthful. And I've noticed that you have been indeed very active both on the national but also in the international scene, and we will come back to that in a minute. But many viewers may also know you for your photographic achievements. You recently had an art walk in our station on India, and I was quite impressed with the quality but also with the content of the pictures. They were very nicely picturing and depicting the culture and the people of India. So do you have that kind of affinity with other cultures as well, or specifically for India?
Really, India is where I've lived with my family for a year in recent years, so I have more depth of experience there than in other countries.
Any plans to go back?
Hopefully this winter.
Wow. Okay, I can only envy you in that regard. But for today we will focus on some of your academic activities. You are the author of a book published in 1995, Democracy and Technology, which still features as a very important book in this regard. You were probably one of the first who linked the discussion on technology to the issues on democracy, but even more importantly with issues of how to get people involved in technological issues, technology assessment, and that has remained some of your activities and also focal points. But you're not only writing books, you also participate in policy debates, and you have a couple of pretty strong statements published by Science and a couple of other important magazines in the field. The latest I came across was the position you took together with some scientists from Yale and Stanford and other places in this country on Obama's recent appointment of a new commission on Americans' nuclear future, nuclear waste, knowledge waste. Can you briefly summarize what the gist of your argument was here?
Yeah, well, basically our concern there was that this radioactive waste commission is proceeding in a normal way with talking primarily to technical experts and some representatives of organized interest groups, but that the country has failed for 40 years to be able to figure out a site for disposing of radioactive waste, and largely that's because of a failure to correctly engage the affected public. So we were talking about a need to involve social scientists on the commission who are experienced in organizing effective forms of citizen participation in decision making. Right. Otherwise, you'll reach decisions, that's easy to do, but you won't be able to implement them.
Right, and that's precisely what you have been working on in other areas as well. But I think it's very important that this not only comes of general public demands and the concerns of citizens at large, but also from a group of scientists, social scientists in this case, who make this kind of argument, and hopefully it will be heard at the proper places. But yeah, let's move to the real issue for today's discussion. That's one of your recent reports published under the Science and Technology Innovation Program of the Woodrow Wilson International Center in Washington, D.C., Reinventing Technology Assessment, a 21st Century Model. Basically, if I summarized for myself, and that's what you have already initiated, you make a strong plea for more participatory interventions and the involvement of citizens groups, the participation of the population at large, in other words, in these kind of more sophisticated and sometimes very dull and boring issues of technology assessment. So you move away from the traditional term technology assessment, and you give it a more participatory twist by calling it participatory technology assessment. Can you briefly explain what you mean by this?
Yeah, well, technology assessment is just the practice of evaluating technology's social effects and environmental effects to inform decision-making. Traditionally, it's been congressional or parliamentary, but it could be any government or corporate decision-making. And traditionally, technology assessment has been done by a group of experts.
Right.
And participatory technology assessment complements that type of expert assessment and says that involving everyday citizens in evaluating technologies, both new technologies and existing technologies, strongly enriches and elaborates and expands upon what experts say. So it's not saying that you need citizen participation instead of expert analysis. It's saying they're strongly complementary. Yeah. Each one fills in niches and in knowledge that the other one does not do such a good job on.
Right, but the argument from the other side is often, but why should we consult with them? They don't really know what is at stake here.
Yeah, it turns, well, you have to develop an educative process so that if you grab people off the street, as we do, right. They won't be able to, you'll be asking them questions about genetic engineering or synthetic biology or geoengineering, and they won't know what those words even mean. So you have to go through an educative process. But if you do that, it turns out that they develop perspectives that go beyond, in certain respects, what experts are going to come up with.
Right. Yeah, I definitely like your approach, but can you give us an example or explain how you have done it in the past?
Do you want to talk about a process and then an example of it?
Right.
I mean, one of the processes that's been most influential in this area was developed in Denmark, where it's called a consensus conference, and the method I'm going to describe has been done in about 15 countries, including here. But the basic process, in the way it works in its idealized form in Denmark, is that if the Danish parliament is going to be debating and legislating in a complex, controversial area, say nuclear power or genetic technology, they will hear from the interest groups and experts, as we do in this country. But in addition to that, they wonder what everyday citizens think. And so they basically appoint a jury of everyday lay people who have no expertise and are not members of organized groups who are working the issue and who are demographically representative of the country at large. And they spend a couple of weekends bringing them up to speed on the issue, maybe having a high school teacher and a journalist brief them on who the actors are. And then they have an event in the Parliament building publicly where a group of experts and stakeholders who all disagree with each other and are knowledgeable testify in front of this lay jury. And the lay jury cross-examines them, and then the experts and stakeholders are politely dismissed, and the lay people spend the day deliberating and then writing up a report in their own language of what their conclusions and recommendations on the issue are, and they announce them at a press conference, a national press conference in the Parliament building.
So it's more or less as is being copied and done in other kind of contexts like the UN a model which is being used in many high schools these days. It's done in the sense that one tries to not copy but imitate or do apply the same kind of procedures as we are normally familiar with in a parliamentary decision-making process, right? But in this case it's more the general public rather than the specialists and the experts who determine the issues and control the agenda.
Yeah.
So why doing it this way? Is there any is there any value in doing it?
Yeah, it turns, I mean, and there's some nice comparative examples. For instance, there was a time in the late 80s when the Congress's Office of Technology Assessment did an evaluation of the social implications of the Human Genome Project, and at the same time, a Danish panel of citizens addressed it. And so you can comparatively look at two groups, one expert, one lay, addressing the same issue at the same time, and each one has something to contribute. The experts have a lot of technical analysis. Their report's 200 pages, but has one tiny chapter on ethics, which says absolutely nothing incisive. It just says, well, it's complicated, you know, on the one hand, on the other hand, and nothing in that small chapter at the back of the report is in the report's executive summary, the 15 pages at the front, which is the only thing that a policymaker will ever read. In contrast, the Danish lay panel addressing the same issue, their report's only 15 pages, so it's analogous to the executive summary, and it's ethics all the way through. And they raise a number of current concerns, like how genetic mapping could alter the concept of normalcy, and will it lead to a concept of human perfection, that we should all be perfect? Will parents start to consider abortions if they discover that a fetus is colorblind or left-handed? And they make a number of practical recommendations that were not even contemplated by the expert analysts. So it really, again, you're going to find things in that expert analysis, a depth of technical analysis that's useful and is not going to be in a lay report, but you also find ethical and social considerations being brought to the table by the lay people that are never going to show up in that expert analysis.
Right. It sounds more or less like the division between the two paradigms in the scientific field. On the one hand, the experts take a more empirical, objective kind of approach, value-free, in other words, to what they are expected to do. On the other side, the citizens, they start from a normative approach. They come up with their own values and start arguing along those lines.
I half agree with you. The only difference is that the experts give the appearance of being objective and value-free, but they can't do it. They, of course, are bringing values to the table in terms of what questions they ask. They might sort of say, what are the economic costs? What are the health or safety things? Well, those are value considerations. Right. And so they have to, as experts, disguise the fact that values are guiding which questions they ask and how they analyze, because their stature depends on maintaining this illusion that as a technical expert, I'm value-free and objective.
Right.
They aren't. What's different is it's a different set of values.
Right.
And so what the problem with just relying on the experts, in order to try to look objective, they end up kind of impoverishing their analysis.
Indeed.
It's not value-free. It has the appearance of value. It has a false appearance of being value-free.
Indeed, indeed. But that's also what most scientific work is about, the appearance of value-free. Freedom, but never explicit declaring their own assumptions and values. So I hear you hinting that that's not your preferred position, that you prefer to take the position of a normative approach to technology assessment.
Well, and I think that there's a way through complementarity and iterating back and forth between expertise and participation that the participatory process could be liberatory in a way for the technical experts, because the technical experts are kind of constrained in order to appear as though they're being professional to stick to certain evaluative considerations, such as economic cost or health and environment. But maybe they also are interested in how a technology would affect parenting or childhood development or gender relations or race relations. But if they were to address that on their own, initiating, it would look like they're being subjective. But if you had a lay panel go first, and the lay panel sort of brings up the questions of how will this technology affect race relations or community structure of power, well then that would give an opening for the experts to say, well, let's evaluate the claims advanced by the lay people, and in a way it could be liberating and empowering for the experts to allow them to actually address questions that from a personal level they might be wishing they could finally address.
So basically what you're suggesting is that one should try to go for a win-win situation, that the lay people can contribute something which the experts then can make use of for their own benefits, because otherwise they would not be able to go in that direction and address or identify the issues at stake. But where do the interest groups sit in all of this?
Well, participatory technology assessment is introducing an informed lay voice into political processes where the interest groups are going to be there anyway. So the organized interest groups have the many ways that they do of lobbying and influencing processes, and that doesn't go away. What this means is that in addition to that, decision makers have the opportunity to listen to what an informed group of lay citizens. So it's complementary. It's not a displacement of those kind of organized interest groups. Yeah. And to some extent, in our political system where there's great disparities of power, it's unrealistic to think that these kinds of participatory processes by themselves, I mean, it's not just because a group of a few dozen lay people give an informed opinion that Congress is going to suddenly say, well, gosh, I never thought of that. Let's just do that and ignore what the insurance companies and the oil companies think. It won't work that way. I mean, the times when this could you know, in a future world, maybe there'll be more egalitarianness and that will be influential. But the times when, in the real world of existing political relations, this could be influential is, first of all, when you're addressing technologies in an anticipatory way that are emerging. There may not be yet
forecasting.
There may not yet be highly organized interests with strong opinions. So there can be a political space where a voice like this could be influential. The other thing is that sometimes corporations or governments, if you're doing, again, the anticipatory work, can find it beneficial to their own interest to listen to what the lay people say, because the lay people sometimes say, if you go down this certain research trajectory, we're going to be reacting very negatively to it. But if you go down this alternative path, we think of that very favorably. So a government or a corporation that has not yet made the investments could say, well, if we invest down this path, we're just going to have a big fight and maybe we won't be able to implement.
Indeed,
if we go down this path, we'll be welcomed as heroes. Well, hey, let's go down this path. And in that sense, it could be, from a social point of view, win-win, because in that case, corporation or government following its own interest is also aligning with citizen opinion. The other thing you're sometimes going to get is what I would call stakeholder amplification, meaning if there is a constellation of organized interests and the lay panel come up with an opinion, well, it's probably accidentally going to coincide on any given issue with some organized interest group who may find it then a political resource to amplify what the lay group has said, because then while advancing their own corporate or government interests, they can say, see, the lay people agree with us. And that again would be an example of a fairly win-win situation. They may not be doing it because they genuinely care about what the lay people think, but it's not a bad thing from a social point of view.
Right, and it's part of their strategy. So what you're hinting at is you add another layer of a space for negotiations.
Sure.
And all the rest will remain neutral, in a sense that all the vested interest, all the players, they are still operating at those levels. So it's not what Habermas would call a free environment where all the different opinions are taken at face value and as a valid starting point for discussion. But by doing it, you also identify what's at stake and make it much more obvious for the vested interests to show their hands rather than to stay behind the scenes.
That's right. Even in situations, in the more pessimistic circumstances where there's a strong constellation of interests and as a result of that, there's no attention whatsoever paid to what a lay panel says, that, if nothing else, is useful in illuminating the fact that the system is kind of rigged against the interests of everyday people. And that's not bad political education.
Yeah, but there's somebody who has to learn from this. And
no, the people actually who have to learn from this are the voters and the citizen and the citizens who have to sort of keep getting the message that there's a struggle here about the unequal distribution of power.
And do they get the message, or do they learn?
Well, no. I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's hard to say. There's certainly plenty of latent frustration. I mean, in a sense, the Tea Party activism is a frustration about disempowerment.
Right, but
I might choose to channel it differently myself, but I think the underlying frustration reflects some recognition of a game in which you're not being allowed to be the player you should be.
Right. But sometimes it's also a matter of how to package or explain the message in such a way that it can be understood by the lay people. Right.
I mean, the first step for us is seeing, can we even institutionalize these processes in the U.S. This Danish process, which is, formally institutionalized in political behavior in Denmark, it has been done about a dozen times in this country, but on an ad hoc basis by university groups, kind of as research projects that demonstrate that American citizens are capable and interested in doing this kind of process. But we haven't yet managed to do it with a government client who's prepared to listen, and that's really, there is a beginning of a possible political opening for that now, but we aren't there yet.
Right. Yeah, you make a reference somewhere to the experiment or the process you went through in Boston with the global warming issue. Can you briefly explain that one?
Well, that was a global citizen participation technology assessment. It was initiated by the Danish government's Office of Technology Assessment, called the Danish Board of Technology.
But you had a counter
well,
project here, right?
it was a participatory exercise that took place simultaneously in 38 nations around the country, around the world, on climate change. It happened 2 months before the UN Copenhagen Conference on Climate Change, and we had 5 sites in the U.S., each with about 75 randomly chosen people. So we had about 325 participants in the U.S. One of the 5 sites was in Boston at the Museum of Science. And so it was a little bit like that Danish process I described, but writ large. It was the first time, as far as we know, that anybody's ever organized a kind of a structured citizen participation at the global scale.
And were there any differences in outcome between the U.S. and other parts of the world?
There were some, but the more dramatic thing was that compared to national decision makers in almost every country, the citizens who had listened to a representation of current scientific opinion on global warming came out. They had been randomly chosen. These weren't green activists or pro-coal or pro-nuclear activists. They were kind of a random cross-section. In almost every country, they came out more green than their policymakers, and this was dramatically so in the U.S. In fact, to some extent, it was almost embarrassing, because we then had to make. Well, we didn't know that would be the result, and I gave a briefing to the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy about the results subsequently, and the immediate issue I knew I would have to address is to demonstrate we hadn't filled the room with Greenpeace activists. This was really a random cross-section, and given a chance not to listen to just sort of whatever radio talk hosts happened to be shouting that day, but to kind of a balanced representation of scientific opinion, they came out pretty darn green.
Yeah, but that's not atypical for these kind of issues.
Well, it was very different from public opinion polling, because public opinion polling, which has been moving the other direction in this country, isn't informed by any type of balanced, structured educational process.
No. But what I mean is that there is definitely a disconnect between what's happening in Washington and what the average citizen in this country and other countries is caring about or discussing about, and sometimes it's not. There's no opportunity for that voice to be heard at higher up levels.
Well, and in this particular case, the staff at the White House were, found it in a sense liberating, because they personally would like to be more green, so they found it encouraging to find out that they weren't where they would like to go is not out of head of where public opinion would be if you had a decent educational process.
So have they taken your advice, and are they going to work on these kind of processes more often, or?
I can't tell where they have said some of the staff from the White House came to the public presentation I gave in Washington in April about these ideas, and they said in public there, Beth Novak from the White House Office of Science and Tech Policy said that the executive branch is interested in doing participatory technology assessment. They said that partly because one of Obama's first acts on coming into office was to say that there'd be an open government initiative that would include citizen engagement throughout the executive branch, and participatory technology assessment would be consistent with that. What I can't yet tell is how serious are they. I mean, they've said the words. It's not yet clear they're prepared to put any resources behind it, and if you aren't willing to put some resources behind it, there's going to be a default probably towards doing inexpensive forms of citizen engagement, like putting up a website and letting people register opinion. And the problem with that, I've told them, is that you just reproduce the constellation of the interest groups. The interest groups mobilize their members, tell them what to say, and you're just going to reproduce that existing power structure, giving it a veneer of citizen engagement. If you want to have something that's meaningful, you have to have an educative, deliberative process with representative samples of people. That doesn't cost a huge, it's well within the bounds of what this country can afford, but it's not clear that the White House is yet willing to put the required resources in.
Right, they haven't given you a call and invite you to come up with a follow-up plan, obviously.
They've asked for the plan, but they haven't indicated whether they're prepared to act on it.
And the other part of what you said is the idea of going for another kind of technological network, putting it up on Facebook or something similar to those kind of web-based networks. That's more in line with what I would call the American technological psyche to be. There is that kind of tendency to opt for technological solutions rather than go for a much more participatory, human-to-human kind of interaction.
Well, a part of the problem is when President Obama said to the entire executive branch, I want you, among other things, to implement citizen engagement, unfortunately, he didn't say why. Mm-hmm. I mean, from my point of view, there is some value in citizen engagement for its own sake, but that's limited. It's also expensive and time-consuming and a pain in the butt sometimes. I mean, so it's really, to me, only valuable if you're organizing it in a way that it leads to better decisions and better social outcomes. But he didn't say, give me citizen engagement so that we'll have better decisions and better social outcomes. He might have taken it for granted, but since he didn't say that, people in the executive branch can say, as long as I'm doing any form of citizen engagement, like putting up a website and letting people vote, well, I'm doing citizen engagement. That's what the president told me to do. So there's kind of a next step. So I mean, it's partly the problem of, as you say, technical fix. Mm-hmm. But there's also, I mean, ultimately the problem is that if you do meaningful, empowered citizen engagement, it means you're challenging existing constellations of power. Right. That means you're spending political capital. Is the administration in a position or willing to do that?
Yeah, so you haven't heard from them, you don't know yet. One last thing which you also point out is the fact that the US was quite advanced in the 80s and 90s up to a certain point with their Office of Technology Assessment, and then that whole idea got cancelled, the office got closed. Any reason, any explanation for that?
It's not, I mean, it was closed in 1995 when Newt Gingrich was in charge of the House of Representatives, and so it was a Republican initiative to close it down. There could be a lot of reasons. I think that ultimately one of the reasons is if you're a fairly, right of center Republican, you think that the free market's always the right answer. Right. If you believe that the free market's always the right answer, you aren't really interested in policy analysis because it's a waste of resources since you already know the right answer is the free market.
Yeah, that's a way to put it. But unfortunately, that's also the reason why the US has lost track in this regard, and other countries, including Denmark and some of the European.
Actually, there are 18. There's no government office of technology assessment in this country at all, except a minuscule one, a tenth the size of the old Office of Technology Assessment or less, within a little teeny one within the Government Accountability Office. But there are now 12 parliamentary technology assessment agencies in Europe and 6 others that aren't parliamentary. So and there's a new European Commission has just awarded a €5 million grant to expand technology assessment into new countries in Europe. So it's vigorous and the practice is expanding rapidly, both in expert and participatory modes all across Europe. Right. And the US is very far behind that. And you can show as a result of the European technology assessment that sensible decisions that are different from those being made here are being made in Europe. So it's influential there. It's not just a practice that they're doing it, but it's having beneficial impacts on policy, and we're kind of lagging in there.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to arrive at. Indeed, they have, for their own reasons, given out the opportunity to stay on top of innovation and technology, forward-looking kind of trend setting, etc. So how this has to be, in conclusion, to be assessed with all the talk about emphasis on education, emphasis on innovation, and emphasis on staying on top of the world from a government and US perspective.
Well, I think there's a misapprehension sometimes in this country, and maybe that partly led to the abolishing the Office of Technology Assessment, that technology assessment will be a hindrance to innovation. Right. The European experience proves the opposite. It's a stimulus. It can be effectively done, as it has been in a number of European countries. It's a stimulus to innovating in ways that are popularly well received and that advance social interests. For instance, it has contributed to Denmark becoming a leader in wind energy.
Right. Okay, so a lot of food for thought, and hopefully also some advice for our policymakers. Thanks, Dr. Sclove, and thank you for your interest.